Hi, Dan.
Hello, Henry. How are you doing?
Not too bad. And yourself?
Okay, I feel a little guilty doing this, I have to confess, because it's the night before my students are begin to take their final exams. So, they're all suffering, and here I am,
Well, I'm goofing off grading to do this, so I guess I don't feel guilty even slightly. The joys
I'm sure your students would support this.
Yeah, the joys of a professor's life.
Yes, exactly. Well, why don't we jump right in? There was some report that came out last week. I don't even remember who wrote it. Involved, I think, James Baker or Lee Hamilton or something like that. But
I have a vague idea I heard of this as well. But I think it's kind of interesting because neither of us, when we were actually thinking about setting this up, thought to talk about the Iraq Study Group or the Iraq Survey Group or the Iraq whatever group it was.
Iraq Study Group, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty interesting. There was an interesting article by Kevin Drum. He had an interesting blog post about it today where he basically said that this had disappeared not with a bang but with a whimper, that nobody was paying any attention to it a week later. I'm not sure if that's true, but certainly it wasn't something that I think either of us necessarily thought that we wanted to address as one of the burning political topics today.
No, I wasn't terribly interested in dealing with it. In part, I think I have to tell you the truth. I mean, I posted an open thread about it on my blog, but I think I suffered from an overdose because when the report came out that day, I mean, they did dominate the news cycle. But since then, you're right. It's sort of slowly faded away, and it's not clear that anything's really going to be implemented. Although I'm not sure I agree with Kevin that the report was a complete failure. It depends on what you thought the report was going to accomplish. I think there were potentially some, particularly for some reason after the midterms, talked about this group as if it was somehow going to come up with a magic solution or provide political cover for a change in strategy that would allow Bush to stop staying the course, as it were. I think this overlooked the fundamental fact about the way Bush operates, which is sometimes he actually thinks he's doing the right thing and will do it, regardless of whether he's either objectively right or not, or regardless of the political advice he's getting. So the fact that Bush has been reluctant to accept some of this advice is not terribly surprising. That said, it's not clear to me, even if the recommendations aren't being implemented, that the report still hasn't somehow sort of shifted the frame of reference, because in two ways. First, it's actually gotten, the report basically said, look, the strategy is, we know it is failing, and it's failing badly. And that in and of itself is sort of one of those, splashes of cold water that, yes, 98% of the population knew already, but perhaps the Bush White House did not know. And so, as a result, he sort of had to swallow that bitter pill. And then the second, which has been interesting, is there's been sort of response by the administration, which has been to sort of meet with everyone, in the government, it seems, to somehow try to show, yes, we're really trying to sound out, new opinions. For example, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Bush met in the White House with Elliot Cohen, with a couple of generals. He met with some of the embassy staff from the Baghdad embassy, in an effort to try to show, see, I'm listening to other people.
All people who, at least many of them, people who either agreed with him in the first place or who were effectively underlings who didn't have much of an incentive to disagree with him volubly.
I completely agree, but what's interesting is that he felt compelled to make the effort. And it was, in that sense, the frame of reference did change. It's forced Bush even more on the defensive on this issue. And I do think it's changed. I mean, the polling evidence is further support of this. I think there was a CBS News poll that showed that a whopping, it came out this week, that showed a whopping 4% of Americans think that America is currently pursuing the right course of action in Iraq. I mean, that's an astonishing number.
Well, here's maybe another way of interpreting this, which is maybe partly in line with what I think Kevin was thinking. Another way in which it has shifted the frame of reference is kind of in showing that there isn't all that much room anymore for a kind of sensible, moderate middle ground. Effectively, the moderate middle ground has shifted to some sort of version of, we need to figure out some way to get out of this situation, what is the best way that we can get, and the kind of idea that you can create a middle ground by squaring the difference between, on the one hand, people who want to stay in there forever, and on the other hand, people who want to get out yesterday, that just has disappeared into thin air. You still see people like David Broder, I guess, trying to make that argument in the Washington Post. But even Tom Friedman has gone from the reservation. And I think when you've lost Tom Friedman, you're basically pretty screwed.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. You're correct in that I don't think there's a need to bridge, at least in terms of there's a political consensus in this country, which perhaps did not exist even as recently as 6 months ago, that the U.S. needs to get out of Iraq. And you could argue that in that sense, the Iraq Study Group was almost the nail in the coffin on that. Not so much in the specific recommendations, but in the general assessment that something is seriously wrong with the status quo. And so in that respect, I do think it achieved something. It did not achieve, what people thought it was going to prior to the election, which was that somehow Baker was going to save Bush on this. And I think this, attributes magical powers to James Baker that, gifted politician and statesman that he might be, he's not going to be able to rescue Bush on Iraq. So I think you're right in that what's interesting is that you have a situation where most of the country wants us to get out of Iraq, and Bush doesn't. And this is going to be an interesting test in the long haul of the power of public opinion. Because I think Bush is, if he continues to stay the course, he's eventually going to run up against a very hard constraint of Americans who do not want to see this continue. And I mean, one of the interesting, this raises a question that is occasionally asked, and I'd be curious about your take, which is, as you're seeing more and more of the public rejecting, the notion that we're on the right course in Iraq and rejecting the idea that we should be staying there, there have not necessarily been the sort of large-scale protests, on the other hand, that we saw during the Vietnam War. And that might be the next step, I'm wondering, but I'm wondering if that step will take place, or whether you're going to see action take place within the political arena itself.
Well, Jacob Weisberg had a piece in the Financial Times, more or less along these lines today, saying that the big difference, of course, had been that there hadn't been all that many demonstrations, and it was a kind of typical Jacob Weisberg, I'm on the left, but not with the smelly hippies kind of piece. But I would think that if there is going to be massive demonstrations, I think it's going to come from a very different source from the kinds of demonstrations that we saw during the Vietnam War, which is this is going to happen when effectively the middle ground shifts so much that people, including people perhaps in the military, begin to just say that they've had enough, that they just can't take it anymore. So it's not necessarily going to be people who are protesting against the war because they feel that it's imperialist, they feel this, that, and the other. It's going to be people protesting just because they feel that this is a travesty, that there's no reason apart from Bush's belief in his own particular version of manifest destiny why we should be in there anymore.
I mean, I agree, let's face it, the big reason that there were protests in the 60s was because it was a conscription army and there was a draft.
Yeah, Weisberg
so it was led by
students.
It's an interesting possibility that if you're going to see protests this time around, it's going to come from, it's going to come from those affected by people being overseas, namely the families of military enlistees and officers, and that's an unusual. It's not an obvious source, but I mean, basically what you're suggesting is, let 1,000 Cindy Sheehan's bloom. Whether that'll happen, I don't know if that'll happen.
Well,
it's possible Bush will change course.
Well, one interesting thing which hasn't happened yet but may yet is the Pat Tillman story, and the way that this person who was put forward as being one of the heroes of the early Iraq War who gets killed. It turns out. Yeah.
Well, be careful. Tillman, I think, was in Afghanistan.
Sorry, you're right. Sorry, I'm getting confused. You're quite right.
Yeah.
Tillman was in Afghanistan, but you do see various family members of his beginning to get extremely upset and talking about it in public. So you may... now, the interesting thing is why this hasn't caught fire as of yet in a major way as a sort of protest movement, but you might begin to see that sort of beginning to take off over the next year, 2 years, if we still haven't gotten out.
It's possible. I think the obvious reason, there's another reason why it hasn't. It's not just the draft. It's also, and I mean, there are a lot of reasons. The simple fact is not a lot of Americans have died yet.
Yeah.
I mean, and by not a lot, I don't mean to trivialize the we're close to 3,000 now, I believe, number of dead from Iraq. But what I'm saying is that in Vietnam we lost, I believe, 55,000 soldiers. So you're talking about an order of magnitude difference between what happened in Vietnam and what's happened in Iraq. Now that's true for a variety of reasons. There's better force protection. Combat medicine has improved, precision guided munitions, and so that you don't need soldiers, and a whole variety of other reasons. But the point is that it's a fact, and therefore, because you have fewer deaths, you have fewer families that are affected. I think that's also partly one thing that might be going on. That even if the strategy is a mistake, and even if it's costly in dollar terms, it is not costly in the loss of life in the same way yet that Vietnam was.
Yeah, that's probably true. The counter side of that, of course, is that the burden has been borne by Iraqis. There was a very interesting piece by Nir Rosen in the Boston Review, the last issue of the Boston Review, which talks about the ways in which various people, it's talking about the civil war that has erupted. She, I think it's a she, I'm not 100% sure, has a pretty good grasp, especially on Shia politics. But there's a discussion there along the way of how various people that she knew, everybody seems to have had a family member or a close friend who has died in the last couple of years in some sort of and whether you buy the sort of higher figures or whether you don't, there's no doubt that at the minimum we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people having died here, which is pretty.
No, that's true, and it ties into the studies that Johns Hopkins has done, which were published in the Lancet. And I agree with you that Iraqis undoubtedly borne the brunt of losses, just as the Vietnamese bore the brunt of it during the Vietnam War. The problem is that Iraqi dead doesn't alter the U.S. debate. Speaking of which, though, one strategy which was proposed also in the past week beyond the Iraq Study Group was an op-ed by three fellow political scientists, Eugene Goltz, Darrell Press, and Ben Valentino, basically proposing a strategy of what's known in our field as offshore balancing, which means that, simply put, all U.S. forces, particularly Army, would be withdrawn from the Middle East, not just Iraq, but across the region. You would have, a very strong naval presence and the ability to project both naval and air power, and potentially, rapid deployment. In case of, let's say an invasion or, of Saudi oil fields. But that they basically pointed out that, look, the threat of an invasion of Saudi Arabia is pretty low. Iran's probably not going to do it. Iraq obviously can't do it right now. And therefore, the presence of U.S. forces in the region acts only as a major irritant and a way for al-Qaeda to rally support and for other radical Islamists to rally support. Therefore, perhaps the best thing the U.S. can do is leave and leave as quickly as possible. And this also obviously has the advantage of being a relatively cost-effective strategy.
Well, I think that that's right as far as it goes. And the three authors, they're pretty good about acknowledging the limits of their proposal as well. That it's pretty good for preventing major military actions from happening, but that effectively it's leaving behind. It's leaving behind a mess, and there are various things that are going to be happening that the U.S. in principle would like to be able to do something about, that it's not going to be able to do something about because it doesn't have a presence in the area. Now, of course, the obvious counter-rejoinder to that is that there's not all that much that the U.S. can do in any event, given where the U.S. is, and given the clear way in which the U.S. is indeed serving as a kind of as a major recruiting sergeant for al-Qaeda and for similar groups. But what I think is important about this piece is that it gets across something that I think hasn't really been discussed enough in the current debate, which is we're effectively talking about some need to retreat, some need for the U.S. to pull out over the next couple of years. But pulling out isn't the end of the story. Pulling out is the sort of beginning of a whole different set of debates and arguments about what should be done next. Should the U.S. just abandon the entire region as being a lost cause? Should the U.S. sort of try to get involved through offshore balancing, as these guys suggest? Also problems like presumably there are going to be tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of refugees who have a direct claim upon the U.S. because of the because they have in some way helped the administration or whatever. And should these people be given some sort of a safe harbor in the United States? Obviously, I would think that the answer to that is absolutely yes. But you can imagine how the politics of that are going to play out, especially given a sort of a bunch of Republican pro-war types who aren't particularly willing to admit that the war is effectively lost, and on the other side a bunch of Democrats who didn't necessarily want to get involved in the war in the first place, and may quite possibly be reluctant to see hundreds of thousands of people coming in to the United States. And then you can imagine.
Well, not to mention this is the perfect storm for populists, for someone like James Webb, because on the one hand, it's a question of getting out of Iraq, and on the other hand, it becomes an immigration question.
Well, it becomes an immigration question with some weird, and here I think sort of people like Webb are maybe going to be less caught up in it than some of the people on the Republican side. And here I'm thinking about pundits like Michelle Malkin. Because you've got immigration,
but we're anti-immigration.
It's immigration, but it's immigration of what these people are going to portray as being Arabs who potentially are going to have a bunch of terrorists among them, and I can see how that debate could go very, very nasty very, very quickly. I can see how there have been some indications among right-wing opinion in particular that there's been a real souring of opinion about Arabs and about what position they should have. A couple of years ago, Glenn Reynolds was effectively accusing anybody who said that Iraq was problematic of being racist, of claiming that this was effectively a claim that Iraqis were irredeemable. And now you get on him talking about this more rubble, less trouble kind of attitude, and seriously questioning whether or not if the Iraqis are aren't able to do it, whether the entire region is full of people who are effectively the implication is politically irredeemable. So I could see a lot of unpleasant stuff happening on the right in particular. I think that there is going to be problems on the left, but I would guess that the specific form of populism that you see emerging on the left is going to be less caught up in this set of issues and caught up maybe in less problematic ways than the right might be, at least if some of the crowd who currently are rabble-rousing on this are the people who become the spokespeople.
I would say two things, and this goes back to the offshore balancing strategy. I mean, looking at it, my response, beyond the initial one, which I posted on the blog, is twofold. There are two problems. There's a short-term problem and a long-term problem. The short-term problem is just saying pull out, and this goes, to all these recommendations. Just saying let's pull out U.S. forces. It's not the sort of thing where you can snap your fingers and suddenly all, 150,000 U.S. troops are gone. It's going to be messy, and messy on an unbelievable, messy in a potentially 1975, helicopters leaving the Vietnamese embassy kind of way.
Yeah.
Precisely because, you're talking about upwards of, I've seen estimates of 900,000 Iraqis that would potentially want, to come to the States. And you're right. I mean, it's going to be a huge issue. So that's one thing, is that the U.S. is going to look unbelievably bad pulling out. And even if it's the right thing to do, short term, this is going to hurt like you would not believe. It's going to sting a lot, and it's going to look ugly. So that's one problem. The second longer term problem is going to be the effect this has on the Saudis, I would say.
Yeah.
Because, it's sometimes, people occasionally accuse Bush and conservatives of being glib about things like reputation, saying we must stay the course because otherwise the reputation takes a hit, therefore we must always stay the course. That can be carried to logical extremes. But that said, there is something to the idea of, reputation mattering here. And the conception, when the U.S. pulls out is going to be the U.S. is not going to send force into the Middle East for a fairly long period of time. And therefore, a key dimension of U.S. power has just, been taken completely off the table. You're going to have to wonder, what are the Saudis going to think? What are the other Emirates in the region going to think? What are the Iranians going to think? And it's not necessarily good.
I would see the Saudi problem as, I think there's a problem there, but I think that the Saudi problem, at least from my limited reading, and I'm not an area expert by any stretch of the imagination, is more about the Shia versus Sunni thing, and clearly the Saudis are going to be deeply, deeply unhappy about the prospect of sort of the Shia majority actually managing to come to power in Iraq in a manner which doesn't allow for some kind of protection of the Sunni minority. And so my read on the Saudis is that there is clearly going to be a reputational hit there, but that the reputational hit is maybe less about the Americans being lily-livered types who aren't going to intervene again no matter what, and more about the Saudis and sort of basically being furious that they have been left with this mess, getting in and intervening. The Iranians may be intervening on their part, and it doesn't bear very much thinking as to what kind of a mess that could result in if we get all of these different.
Right, and there have been reports this week that one of the reasons that Vice President Cheney was summoned to Riyadh was that basically the Saudis told him, look, if you guys pull out, we're going to back the Sunni in Iraq. We're not going to see, a dominant Shia crescent emerge. And you can't blame the Saudis, that's completely within their national interest. The problem is going to be, as I said, is that if the U.S. pulls out, it is not going to be able to constrain what the Saudis do in the region. They obviously can't constrain what the Shia do. And so as a result, the real concern becomes Iraq not just as a civil war, but Iraq as the central battleground for a wider Sunni-Shia conflict. And that's, and that might be the one thing that if the U.S. actually stays in the country, it actually can prevent. By staying in there, it's going to stop the Saudis from getting in even larger, and as a result leading, to a much wider conflagration. Now, I'm not sure that in and of itself is a reason to justify a continued sustained U.S. presence in Iraq. But I think that is a clear, tangible cost and dramatic implication of leaving. And there was something I think that Suzanne Nossel pointed out, potentially, at least in her blog post to Democracy Arsenal as well.
Well, the countervailing argument to that would be the Josh Marshall argument, which is he had a post a couple of days ago where he said that back when he was on talking terms with the neocons and their various democratic supporters, one of the things that was going around a lot was effectively that the U.S. should enter in on the Shiite side, effectively to try and basically turn the region upside down and to create a version of regional stability which would effectively see various Sunni regimes in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that were considered dangerous, at the very least having their wings clipped and perhaps finding themselves taken off the table altogether. So the counter-argument then, I think, on the basis of that would be, given some of the crazies who there still are in the administration, admittedly they're not as loud and vociferous as they once were, but they still do play a role. Can the U.S. be trusted to remain in Iraq as an honest broker between the two sides, or is the U.S. inexorably going to be pulled in to intervene on the side of one group rather than another? And I think that there's some reason for believing that the U.S., even with good intentions, is going to find itself effectively protecting the Shiites as its clients, and again, that could lead to some pretty unpleasant consequences, both for U.S. reputation and for long-term stability in the region.
Yeah, so I don't think we're unfortunately not going to solve the Iraq mess. I think we should probably move on to
two things which we actually can have moderately constructive things to talk about rather than identify the extent of the problem.
Right. So you emailed me a story. There's a renewed debate. This has been ongoing for a couple months, but I see Paul Krugman has an article in the prestigious peer-reviewed journal Rolling Stone about growing inequality in the United States and growing income inequality in the United States. How the Bush administration accelerated the process, and how this is bad.
Yeah, well, I think this is the distillation of stuff he's been saying in his columns over the last few years. I also think that this is pretty clearly it's a taster. He's apparently writing a book on inequality in the United States, so presumably this is helping to prepare the ground for that and trying to make it into part of the debate. But I think also clearly this has become part of the debate, especially in the wake of the November elections, in a way that it wasn't before. People, I think, on both sides of the aisle are beginning to recognise it as being a real problem, and very clearly the centre of gravity has shifted in the Democratic Party in particular. We were talking about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago with regard to populism and trade, but when you see people like Rubin talking about this as a major problem, Rubin wasn't talking about that in the 1990s. I'm sure that Rubin is a sort of nice and wonderful guy and all that, but I don't think that Rubin would be talking about this kind of stuff unless he felt that it was necessary in order to protect the specific kinds of things that he's interested in. So I think this is going to be on the agenda, and it's going to be pretty interesting to see how the Democrats, and I think in the longer term the Republicans, try to respond to that, because I could see Republicans too beginning to articulate some kind of a attempted response to it. And Ross Douthat, I've no idea whether I'm pronouncing his name rightly, and his fellow co-blogger had an interesting piece about a month, 6 weeks ago, where they effectively were making the claim on behalf of a Republican conservatism, which was more sensitive to income inequality things. And again, I think they are writing a book about it at the moment.
I mean, maybe this is the libertarian in me. I'm persuaded by part of Krugman's, argument. I think empirically, there's no question. You're right that income inequality has widened. I think the more disturbing issue, and this is one that I think conservatives probably do want to, would be wise to grab onto, is this question of income mobility. To be honest, as a libertarian, I don't care if there's widening income inequality, so long as the lower, the bottom quintiles are not losing out absolutely. I do care, however, if people who start off in the lower quintiles can't move up, so that's the question, which is, this goes to the difference of equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. Is it possible for and is it indeed not like, I guess likely. Is it possible that someone can, starting off in the bottom, by, playing according to the rules of the game, move up the economic ladder? And one of the things that Krugman hints at, although he doesn't provide any evidence for it, is the suggestion that, in fact, America has become a more stratified economic system than, let's say, even Europe or, other economies that are seen as more sclerotic. And actually, this ties into an interesting point that David Card brought up. David Card, a very prominent labor economist who was interviewed in Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis that a lot of economic bloggers link to. Card pointed out something interesting, which is that a lot of the economists that he trains now are the children of PhDs. That increasingly, whereas Card was raised on a farm, he now says that upwards of 60% of the cohorts that he teaches that are getting PhDs in economics are faculty brats, basically. And that's an alarming concern. The idea that, that professions have almost become inherited, that's a concern. And that's something that Krugman talked about slightly, but not nearly enough, I think. That's an issue that strikes me as potent. Go ahead.
Well, let's take that as as an issue that I think we both agree with, and move on to the one which we disagree on, because I think that's maybe more interesting to talk about.
Yeah.
Which is, and here let me throw something at you, which I think is at least a plausible case that Krugman begins to articulate here, which I think is something that libertarians ought to find disturbing too. And that's at the very end of the piece, where he talks about research that Sokolov has done on differences between North and South America. And here I think this is not only Sokolov, it's another guy, Engerman. They have a very nice piece in the Journal of Economic Perspectives about, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago now, which sets out some of their main findings. They've also done a bunch of more recent stuff which develops this at greater length. And effectively their argument goes something like as follows. The traditional story about the economic differences between North and South America has been the kind of story that people like Douglas Norris have given, which is effectively a story about how these are driven by fundamental differences in institutions, and institutions where in North America you get the common law, you get all of these wonderful things which produce sort of prosperity and stability and and secure property rights and whatever. In South America you get sort of insecure property rights. You get people having a sort of strong incentive to basically try to sort of take the property rights of others, to leech upon others' labour and so on. Well, what Sokoloff and Engelman argue, and they've got some interesting long time series data to try and not prove this obviously, but at least to support it, is that sort of when you get is that the key variable here is in fact not so much differences in institutions, which is a kind of intermediary variable, it's income inequality. And effectively, when you have societies with high income inequality, then them that has then have increased bargaining leverage vis-a-vis them that has not, and can effectively use this bargaining leverage to introduce institutions which effectively perpetuate their stronger positions. So that would seem to suggest that part of the causal story here might be that in fact income inequalities, to the extent that they become greater, in fact do at least in part produce the kinds of hierarchicalization and stratification that you're worried about. When you have actors which have grossly disproportionate economic capital, they can use this capital in order to shape social institutions in such a way as to perpetuate their own hegemony. Now, whether
this ties into Krugman's argument, which he's made he's either hinted at or talked about briefly in a lot of his columns, and my guess is he's going to flesh out in this book, which is that, in fact, it's twofold. First, what you were just suggesting, which is economic inequality, if it becomes so high, has a lock-in effect, which is once you hit that point, it's tough to escape it, precisely because you get political mechanisms and other mechanisms that reinforce the status quo. And then second, highly unequal societies are also low-growth societies. That Krugman is very fond of pointing out the sort of heyday of the U.S. economy was the 50s and 60s, where you actually had this sort of great compression in terms of income inequality, and therefore that's the sort of days we should return to. I'm not completely persuaded by this for a couple of reasons. The first is that, again, it's a question of whether or not income inequality is the precise thing we should be talking about. For example, if you talk about it in terms of consumption, this is what the conservative rejoinder is, there is not a great deal of consumption inequality. In fact, consumption inequality hasn't widened by all that much.
There was a piece in the last few days which argues that in fact it's widened more than we thought, that it's widened more than we thought.
That's possible. Although I was looking at Greg Mankiw's blog, and he's got he links something that argues that actually it hasn't. So, but I can accept that it's potentially disputable. But I do think let me put it this way: the consumption gap is not nearly the same as the income gap. The second thing, and this is important for what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years, is that in part what's happened in the United States is that a lot of Americans have gotten rich not necessarily from income increases, but from capital gains. That is, the assets they already held increased in value, either in terms of equities or, more importantly, much more importantly, their houses. And what's interesting is that, and I talked about this, even 2 years ago, I think 2 years ago when I responded when Krugman was first talking about this, it strikes me that the basic staples in the United States of a middle-class lifestyle are two things. The first is a college education, and the second is home ownership. And despite, widening gaps in income, both of those things have gone up consistently over the last 50 years. They haven't been slowed down by this widening income inequality. And so it's not clear to me that the projected political effects of income inequality that Krugman and others talk about are actually going to pass, because those who do not seem to be benefiting as much are still actually, achieving the key markers that, are widely perceived as achieving the middle class.
Well, if it's a piece Ezra Klein had on Tapped. I've just been looking at it. This is one of, I guess, the joys of this kind of way of broadcasting, that you can surreptitiously look up stuff on the web in order to reinforce points while the other person is talking. And,
I was busy looking at the camera. Okay, now I got to get back to the computer. Go ahead.
Okay, so Klein links, this is on the American Prospect weblog, he has a piece saying, and I quote, you occasionally hear that the American economy is really 6 types of awesome. Though inequality is widening and wage growth has been weak, Americans buy a lot of stuff, and middle class and working class Americans are even more determinedly consumptive than their upper class brethren. Problem is, it just ain't true. Those with lower salaries do spend a great percentage of their incomes buying stuff, but they do not outspend the rich. According to the New York Times, consumption spending from low-income households is down sharply since 2001. Not so for the high-income households. In 2005, the top 20% were responsible for 39% of all consumer expenditures, the highest share since the government began keeping track in 1984. Now, so clearly this is a sort of left-of-centre spin on a particular set of economic figures, but that would suggest that at least the problem is increasing, and it seems to have increased quite substantially over the last 3 or 4 years. Whether that's just cyclical variation or whether that's something more than that, clearly you'd have to go into the numbers to look and see, but there may be something there.
Okay, I am linking, on the other hand, I've got Greg Mankiw, who tells me that there are studies by, among others, Diana Furchtgott-Roth that shows little change in consumption inequality from 1985 to 2005. So, let's put it this way. Unfortunately, now my computer is naturally frozen up, so I'm not going to get to the actual data. But the point is, there are countervailing studies on this one. I don't think we're going to get this resolved, but I guess... And furthermore, this also overlooks something else which is interesting. I mean, again, Krugman's timing is interesting because he talks about how in 2006 he's not expecting wage growth, to be all that great. But my understanding is that wage growth actually has picked up a fair amount, not just in the last year, but also in the last quarter, to the point where now, Kevin Drum is bashing Ben Bernanke because Bernanke is potentially concerned about inflation.
But I just wanted to say one other thing. Krugman actually has something else interesting to say on this in his, which maybe bears upon the respective merits of the New York Times piece that Ezra links to and the research that was linked to by Greg Mankiw. He talks about the way, which is not news to any of us, but which is something which I think happens regularly in the policy debate. If you pick your years and this kind of stuff, you can prove pretty well damn anything you want to prove. So it could well be that both of them are right. The question is as to which specific time period is the better to study for this particular set of issues. Yeah. And seeing as I guess we don't have access to the original research on either side, it's a little hard to say.
Okay. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else we... I mean, you had said briefly you wanted to talk about the fact that that Krugman, the contrast between Krugman's sort of discussions of these issues versus Card's discussion of these issues.
Well, I thought one of the interesting things in that Card interview was that he talks about some of his early stuff, the work I think was with Kruger, which effectively argued that raising the minimum wage probably didn't have all that great an effect on the on unemployment. Right. And this turned into, as you know, some incredibly controversial research. And he talks about how he lost a bunch of friends as a result of this. And he said that he hadn't...
At Chicago, no less.
Yeah, surprising. He said that he hadn't done... He more or less moved away from that area of research, basically because he didn't want to become perceived as being somebody whose work was driven by political positions and who was effectively somebody who was directly engaged in political debates. And I think that's pretty interesting as a contrast with Krugman, because clearly Krugman is another extremely eminent economist who has moved into political debates and also who has moved outside of his area of direct expertise in so doing. Now, we may disagree on this. I think in Krugman's case, it's proved to be pretty beneficial back in the days of 2001, 2002, in the run-up to the Iraq War, when there weren't all that many people at all in the chattering classes who were concerned with what was happening with the war in Iraq and with various other things, various other aspects of economic policy, the effects of the tax cuts and so on. Krugman was somebody who, time and time again, was sort of pounding upon these issues and got some criticism from people, I believe yourself included.
Myself included, yeah.
And I think in a lot of this stuff, he's turned out to be right. There's Andrew Sullivan, who called him shrill on Iraq, and sort of has ended up sounding like a sort of deranged, more deranged, shriller, harsher version of Krugman himself in the last 12 to 18 months over the Bush administration. Yep. And so the question is, I think this raises some interesting questions. Should academics confine themselves purely to academic debate? Should they get involved in wider political debates? When they do so, should they move beyond their area of expertise? And clearly, given that the two of us have effectively become F-list celebrities as a result of our blogging and our Blogging Heads TV's appearances, it's something that I think is of direct interest to you and me.
First of all, I love F-list. That's I'm going to put that on my CV from now on. Second, I mean, you're right. This gives me a nice opportunity to say, look, Krugman, to some extent was right in 2001. Although I maintain that his rhetorical strategy was, to some extent, off-putting for a lot of people. But and it's off-putting even in the Rolling Stone piece. I mean, in the Rolling Stone piece, Krugman actually, suggests that, just at the end of 2002, because of Enron and WorldCom and all that, just as we were starting to seeing, reform for that, Bush invades Iraq. Now, the obvious implication there in the sentence is that the reason we invaded Iraq was somehow to distract America from, reform of corporate governments, which, again, just strikes me as this classic over-the-top formulation that makes it tough for me to take him seriously on a whole variety of other matters.
I read that a little differently, but go on.
Oh, okay, all right. Maybe it was the way the pump was primed. But that said, let's face it, I think this depends on a couple of things. First, it depends on the nature of the person. It's possible that Card simply was not comfortable engaging in these. It requires a pretty thick skin to engage in these debates, even in the F list, much less in the waters that Krugman's swimming in. For a lot of economists, they're not going to be comfortable doing that. And also, I do think, it's interesting to, and I'm not an economist, but it would be interesting to know whether or not Krugman's lost something along the way that Card is not, which is, when Card talks about these issues, what was interesting was that people who were not ideologically simpatico with Card in the blogosphere still linked to the conversation. In other words, they thought what Card had to say was interesting and valid, in a way that I'm not sure they would necessarily always do with Krugman.
Well, another interesting case in point is Brad DeLong, because Brad, I think, is somebody who I imagine has quite self-consciously done this. If Brad had not become Brad, he probably would have been in with a good shot of taking up a position in the next Democratic administration.
Now the Obama administration, which we'll get to in a second.
And now you can imagine sort of exactly how his Senate hearings would go if he ever got to that stage, which would be extremely unlikely. He effectively has sort of gone out there on a limb, presumably because he felt, given his political persuasions, that it had to be done, and effectively has rendered himself, sort of somebody who very clearly is is going to be politically unacceptable to a sort of wide range of right-wing opinion. So, you could say that Krugman has certainly lost something, but by the same token,
But he's gained some. No, he's undeniably gained some. I don't mean to suggest that he's, he made the wrong choice. What I'm saying is that it is a choice, and the choice does come with some costs. And there are ones that David Card was not willing to pay. And also, I would add, I would pay cash money to see Brad DeLong in a Senate confirmation hearing on anything. It would just be, prices. Also, it would be worth it just to see a Brad DeLong press conference, because if you think the senators would be hostile, that's nothing compared to what how the press corps would be dealing with him, I suspect. He
certainly has not gone out of his way to be softly lovey-dovey towards the press and towards.
No,
but again, it's pretty clearly it's a choice he's made. He's decided this is, given his predilections, this is what he wants to do. And also, which I think is pretty interesting, he's pretty clearly signalled that if the Democrats start moving far towards the populist end of the spectrum, that he's going to start on sort of hammering away at them in more or less the same kind of way. So it's a certain kind of, sort of he's clearly rendered himself politically unacceptable to a whole bunch of people, but he's done so in a, at least I think in a quite principled fashion.
Yes.
But another interesting question about the card piece, which I thought was, when he talks about how his friends basically stopped talking to him, our specific empirical argument, which seems to him to come from the data, that he says that people felt that he betrayed himself as an economist by so doing. I was trying to think, as political scientists, is there something that we could do that would sort of cause our colleagues to effectively shun us? And I couldn't really come up with very much. I mean, sort of maybe write something and sort of defending sort of the torture memos or whatever might be enough. As sort of John Yoo, as I would suspect, become largely shunned among legal academics. Maybe write something saying that democracy is terrible and we need autocracy as the...
I think actually that was what first came to mind. It would be to argue that either fascism or communism generates higher rates of growth, and in fact we should switch regime types as a result. That would be the one thing that might be a true taboo, although even there, this was argued by a fair number of political scientists during the Cold War. In part because there was at least a transient phenomenon where that seemed to be the case. I'm not sure if there's anything that would... Let me put it this way. That might be the case. It also might be the case that that's true because there is less of a body of orthodox knowledge within political science such that we could write something that would seem like heresy.
That's true. And I think there's also something which is interesting happening in economics at the moment, which is that I think you're getting a generation clash to some extent, which is to say you've got a bunch of people who are brought up with a certain kind of orthodoxy, and with various kinds of orthodoxies, sort of the Paul Samuelson version of neo-Keynesianism, sort of Greg Mankiw or sort of Marty Feldman or whoever
Marty
Feldstein rather, their particular sort of right of centre style on this, but very definitely with a set of commitments to a certain particular way of modelling the world. Then you get these people, this newer generation, and it's not only Card, it's people like Stephen Levitt, who are much less interested in the sort of abstract models, and much more interested in the data, and figuring out ways to torture the data so that it can actually say things that you might have expected ever to have coughed up. And
I'm not sure that's entirely true. It might just be the case that it's the economists like Card and Levitt that have attracted more attention than they used to. In other words, it's not. I don't know if the change is within the economics profession. And again, I'm still mostly saying this as an outsider. As much as the economists that attract wider public attention now are not the grand theorists. They're the ones who actually come up with these sort of quirky, empirically creative experiments that show the practicality of economics.
I think it's part of both. I mean, I'm a consumer of this stuff. I'm not a serious economist, but even from looking through the serious economic journals of the last few years, there seems to me to be a change. You see a lot more pieces which are statistical pieces, which are effectively trying to find some interesting, weird indicator, sort of that allows you to get at some statistical relationship without effectively getting embroiled in all the various problems that you get embroiled with usually if you try to study these complex causal relationships. So I think that now whether the shift is an epochal shift, I doubt. So I think that the kinds of modelling that go on clearly are going to be at the heart of economics for a long time to come. But I also do think that there is that people in economics are being forced to make room for the statistical whiz kids, who I think are much harder to pin down. So I read Levitt's book, I've read Levitt's articles. I had no idea what Levitt's politics were. I would have guessed slightly right of centre, but I see that he's now come out as an Obama file, which I guess leads into maybe another topic we want to talk about briefly.
Yeah.
And I didn't have very much of a sense that he was committed, say, to the stuff that Gary Becker, who seems in some ways like him, to the kind of stuff that he was committed in terms of sort of what was the basic core principles that you had to subscribe to in order to be an economist.
Well, maybe this suggests that economists of this generation, much like potentially the politicians of this generation, can somehow bridge stale ideological divides, which brings us, of course, to Barack Obama, who just had a little road trip to New Hampshire to promote his book and once again tantalize the American public with the prospect of him running for president. And this has been a major theme that Obama has been pushing, which is that, one of his advantages is precisely because he's so young and because he wasn't an active, national player, prior to 2004, that he's not entrenched in these sort of, partisan feuds of both the 90s and the early Bush years. And that therefore he's got a different voice and it's a fresher voice. Plus, and this is a slightly separate topic, Obama's got political, he's got a light touch, which is quite impressive. I mean, two things that I saw, while surfing the web was first when he called this...
the apology.
Yeah, when he apologized, he was holding a press conference at, I believe, Southern Illinois University, and he unintentionally embarrassed a student journalist who showed him up, and the student journalist wrote about this, saying, this made him look bad in front of a girl he wanted to ask out. And Obama found out about this and actually called up.
And apologized for it.
And apologized. And did it in a graceful way, and got the journalist to laugh along with him. And then also he actually introduced the Monday Night Football game this past Monday between the Bears and whoever the Bears were throttling. Or again, he shows that he's got a sense of humor. And there was a great New York Magazine profile of Obama that talked from about a week or two ago that also talked about this. That the thing about Obama, even on the Senate floor, is that he's acutely he doesn't quite have the pomp of a normal senator, I guess would be the way to put it. That he's willing to to crack wise, and that's something that even if I don't like Obama's politics, culturally I very much find appealing.
Well, he's got a raw political talent that I think I haven't seen. He has more than Clinton had, and Clinton had a lot. McCall, my wife and I went to see him speak about I'd say a year and a half, 2 years ago, and you come away.
See Obama speak.
Yeah, see Obama, and you come away completely convinced. So he gets up. So he's a slightly gangly looking guy. So with a slightly goofy kind of grin. But once he gets into his stride speaking, he has something. He really manages to. And as you say, he has this light touch. So I think especially the sort of when he apologizes to some guy for ruining his game, and so clearly this is a crafty PR move as well.
Of course.
It's made available as an MP3. That's something that's going to get circulated. So you're going to get people emailing that to each other, and so that's just a pretty brilliant political move. Now, I'm a lefty, and I probably would, I would prefer to see John Edwards being the Democratic nominee, because I think that Edwards is doing more stuff than the stuff that I care about. But in terms of political talent, I think Obama is pretty extraordinary, and I think that it's if and there's a real possibility that he could pull it off, if he manages to become the nominee, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what he does, and to see whether he manages to convince the country. And one thing which I think is, again, pretty interesting, if you look at his approval ratings in Illinois, he's in the 80% plus bracket, and you've lived in Chicago and I haven't, but I know a bunch of my sort of fellow Irish Americans and other people. There are a whole bunch of stone cold racists in Chicago and in upstate Illinois, and he seems to have managed somehow to convince them that he isn't a threat, that he's their guy. So if he can pull that off on a national scale, it'll be very interesting.
I will defend my city of Chicago a little bit. It's not all stone cold racist, for the record. But yeah, I mean, Obama's election to the Senate. He ran a good race, but he also was the beneficiary of some enormous screw-ups by his opponents. And so it's an interesting question of how history would have played itself out if a couple of things had not happened. But that said, by getting himself elected and by them seizing the mantle, I mean, you're right, his popularity has gone through the roof. I think the interesting thing that's going to happen down the road if he runs, and I think I saw a Newsweek story that suggests he's 80% certain he's going to run, is going to be not how he plays with Republicans, but rather, let's face it, there are a couple of other Democrats that are still running and that are considered the front runners. Hillary Clinton, as you said, John Edwards. John Kerry, I think, still believes in his own brain that he could run, although I don't think he would work for anywhere else. Potentially Al Gore. Didn't Dennis Kucinich announce that he was running?
Yeah.
Yeah. But more seriously, I think Edwards and Clinton and a few others, it's going to be a potentially nasty race, a nasty primary fight. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not, while Obama's a man of very rare political gifts right now, let's face it, he hasn't had to...
He's not been tested under fire.
No, he hasn't been tested in a real fight with other Democrats. And so, at least on the national stage, he did in Illinois. And so this is going to be interesting to see, let me put it this way. Even as someone who probably disagrees with Obama on probably about, two-thirds of his policy positions, from a half to two-thirds of his policy positions, I still find myself, captivated by the guy's political gifts. And it's, as a political junkie, I'm going to enjoy watching this. I want him to run because I want to see the effect it's going to have on the race. And I'll be interested to see what actually happens. But the other thing I'm going to be interested to see is whether or not the media actually starts,
souring on him.
Taking. Yeah, I mean, he's had a. How to put this gently? The media seems fond of him. That would be a good way of putting it.
I'm guessing at the metaphor you were groping away from there, and the media seems extremely fond of him. And so he's got the kind of that Tiger Woods thing going, sort of just seeming like a on the one hand, sort of somebody who's black, but on the other hand, managing somehow to sort of at least at the moment sneak past a bunch of, I think, the the assumptions that, say, somebody like Harold Ford in Tennessee clearly had a lot more difficulty in getting past. One interesting datum is that there was a poll from Iowa today, and apparently Edwards has 36%, Hillary has 16%, and Obama has 13%. Now, those are early days yet, but it's... frankly, I found that a little surprising. I would have expected to see sort of the three of them bunched up much closer together. And the other interesting question is, given that on both sides of the aisle the primary season is going to be so accelerated the next time, what that's going to do to the dynamics, whether we're still going to see the same kind of nastiness and strategic whatever developing, it's just going to be hard for politicians to do that in quite the same way. Clearly there's going to be a lot of opposition research and framing going on in the months coming up to the thing, but given how fast this is going to go, whether or not they're going to be able to do it while people are actually paying attention to it, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I agree with you. I think it's just it shifts the nastiness. Instead of taking place in 2008, it's going to take place a lot more in 2007. And you're right. The American people aren't necessarily going to pay attention to it, but a lot of but we are, and other politicos are. And the point is that whatever attacks are used by in the primaries are basically going to be fair game. Therefore, for in the general election to be used as well. The poll in Iowa doesn't shock me, by the way. I mean, Edwards did very well there in 2004, and my understanding is Edwards has been to Iowa. A fair amount since then. So I'm not. That's a testament to Edwards' strength in Iowa. I'm not sure it's a testament to anything else.
Yeah, no. Clearly, Edwards' strategy has been Iowa, Nevada, and South Carolina. Iowa, he's been paying a lot of attention to. Nevada, he's got the support in all but name of the SEIU, which is so basically of the big service unions in Nevada, which have a big role in the Nevada primaries. And South Carolina, obviously, he hopes to do well. But if Obama is in the race, then clearly Obama is going to be particularly a challenge to him in South Carolina.
No, let me put it this way. I used to say I want to see Obama run just because to see the effect, the shockwave it's going to have. And I got to say, even as a Republican, it's kind of nice to think that the two the two people that we're talking about, well, the three people, counting Edwards, I guess, but the two of the leading candidates for the Democratic nomination would be a woman and a black man. I mean, we're still at the point where, at least at the presidential level, that in and of itself is an interesting, potentiality. I think we're kind of over time now, so I know we were supposed to talk about the trans fat ban
I think we
New
can
York.
leave that till next time.
I think we can leave that. Let's just, I think, you support it, I'm against it, and we'll just leave it
Yeah.
at that.
Okay.
But maybe that'll be an issue for, after New Year's, once, we start talking about dieting.
Which will be seriously needed. I'm going to go to Ireland and I'm going to be stuffed by my family full of all sorts of, not necessarily trans fats, but definitely fatty foods.
That sounds wonderful. All right, well, until then, happy holidays to you and
Happy
yours.
holidays back to you.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.